February 1943, Tunisia. Veterans of the Afrika Korps are walking among smoking M3 half-tracks and brand-new M4 Shermans. The engines are still warm. The keys are in the ignitions. In the distance, leaderless American soldiers are retreating in complete disarray. The Germans survey this battlefield and make a brilliant, nearly perfect tactical analysis. American coordination is abysmal. Their officers are inexperienced, and they have no idea how to use their own magnificent equipment. But this perfectly accurate diagnosis is about to become one of the most dangerous intellectual traps of the entire war. The trap was this: the German commanders standing in the desert didn't just see a badly beaten opponent on a bad day. They believed they were looking at a permanent truth. They concluded that while a wealthy nation might be able to mass-produce brilliant machinery, it could never manufacture fighting spirit or competent leadership. In their minds, the clumsy, terrified force fleeing across the sand wasn't just a green army in its first real fight. It was the unchangeable identity of the American military. This isn't another standard retelling of the Battle of Kasserine Pass. It isn't a conventional tale of seasoned veterans outsmarting rookies, or just another clash of famous generals. This is the story of how an overwhelming tactical triumph created a blinding, fatal illusion. The victory in North Africa was so absolute and the resulting German analysis so precise that it forced the victors to prepare for the exact wrong enemy, while German intelligence confidently filed away their reports, cementing the belief that the United States was materially terrifying but psychologically brittle. The Americans were looking at the very same smoking wreckage. But they didn't see an irreversible character flaw. They saw a brutal, undeniably accurate diagnostic report. How did a humiliating defeat become the blueprint for survival? How did the Germans spend the next year meticulously building defenses to fight a memory, while the United States ruthlessly dismantled its own peacetime culture and returned to the battlefield as an entirely unrecognizable machine of war? To understand how that blinding illusion took root, we have to rewind just a few weeks before the massacre in the desert. We need to look at the massive, untested machine the Americans brought to North Africa and the hardened veterans who were waiting for them in the dust. In early 1943, the United States Army in Tunisia looked like a terrifying, unstoppable force, if you only measured war by tonnage and inventory. The American logistical footprint was staggering. Ports and depots were overflowing with mountains of wooden crates, miles of fuel drums, and thousands of rugged 2.5-ton trucks. The troops were driving the brand-new M4 Sherman, a medium tank that represented an absolute marvel of automotive engineering, reliability, and crew comfort compared to the crude machines of the early war. To an observer walking through the staging areas, the United States military was an overwhelming manifestation of industrial might. They had the food, the ammunition, the boots, the radios, and the steel. But underneath this pristine, terrifying exterior was a peacetime force that had absolutely no idea how to function under the chaotic, crushing pressure of actual combat. The American Army in North Africa was essentially a collection of well-equipped civilians in uniform who had learned their trade from textbooks and controlled maneuvers in Louisiana. They understood the administration of war, but not the execution of it. Their branches operated as separate, distinct tribes. Armor commanders trained with armor. Artillery officers stuck with their guns. Infantry units operated in their own bubbles. The concept of combined arms, the fluid, instinctive integration of tanks, infantry, artillery, and air support into a single striking fist, was a theoretical idea written on paper, not a reflex forged in fire. They were an army of rigid procedures. There was no clearer human symbol of this systemic, peacetime dysfunction than the man commanding the American Second Corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall. It is easy to look back and simply label Fredendall an incompetent commander, but his true significance lies in what he represented. He was the ultimate manifestation of an untested military culture that believed the war could be managed remotely, like a large-scale engineering project, without confronting the bloody reality at the front edge. 70 miles behind the front lines, near the town of Tebessa, Fredendall established his command post. He didn't just requisition a local building. Obsessed with the threat of enemy air attacks, he ordered 200 engineers to spend weeks blasting a massive, bomb-proof bunker complex directly into the solid rock of a deep ravine. The troops sarcastically dubbed it Speedy Valley. While his soldiers were freezing in the mud of the forward positions, Fredendall buried himself beneath tons of earth and concrete. From this isolated subterranean fortress, Fredendall attempted to fight a war through telephone wires and vague radio broadcasts. He almost never visited the front lines to look his unit commanders in the eye, to feel the morale of the troops, or to personally inspect the jagged, unforgiving terrain of the Tunisian mountains. Instead, he stared at maps and issued highly detailed, micromanaging orders from afar. He dictated exactly where individual companies should dig their foxholes, routinely bypassing his own divisional commanders. To make matters worse, Fredendall communicated over the radio using a bizarre, homemade slang that completely bypassed standard military terminology. He would order subordinates to use your little boys or go smash 'em, leaving field officers thoroughly confused about what exactly the commanding general wanted them to do. Fredendall systematically broke apart his own divisions, scattering small, isolated detachments across dozens of miles of hills and passes. He placed them on high ground, but left the valleys between them completely undefended and unpatrolled. There was no mutual support. If one unit was attacked, the neighboring unit was too far away to help. This wasn't just the failure of one man. This was the failure of a systemic peacetime mindset that believed lines drawn on a map in a quiet bunker would hold firm against a living, breathing enemy. And waiting just across the rugged eastern Dorsale Mountains was the most dangerous living enemy on the planet. The veteran German Afrika Korps was the mirror opposite of the American Second Corps. If the Americans were an army of pristine machines and zero experience, the Afrika Korps was an army of dying machines and perfect experience. By early 1943, the German forces in North Africa were physically exhausted. Their supply lines across the Mediterranean had been strangled. They were chronically starved of fuel, replacement parts, and ammunition. Their uniforms were sun-bleached and ragged. Their Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs were scuffed, sandblasted, and held together by desperate field repairs and cannibalized parts. Materially, they looked like a defeated force, but the Afrika Korps possessed an invisible, lethal weapon that American factories could not mass-produce. 2 years of uninterrupted, merciless desert warfare. The men of the Afrika Korps had survived the grinding campaigns against the British, the punishing climate, and the constant friction of their own logistical nightmares. War was no longer a theoretical exercise for them, it was their natural habitat. Through years of trial and error, combined arms had become pure muscle memory. A German panzer commander advancing across a valley didn't need to frantically call a bunker 70 miles away to request artillery support. The German artillery observers were already moving with the tanks, reading the battlefield, anticipating the enemy's reaction, and preparing the fire missions before the first shot was even fired. The motorized infantry intuitively knew exactly when to dismount and clear a path for the armor. Reconnaissance units constantly probed the edges, feeding real-time intelligence directly to the striking forces. Furthermore, the German tactical philosophy relied heavily on initiative at the lowest possible level. If a situation changed abruptly on the ground, a junior German officer was expected to immediately assess the threat and act decisively without waiting for permission from his superiors. The American system required information to slowly filter up the chain of command, be processed in a bunker, and travel back down as an order. The German system empowered the tip of the spear to think, react, and kill in real time. This was the terrifying mismatch slowly materializing in the Tunisian winter. It was not merely a clash of tanks or rifles. It was the inevitable collision of two entirely different realities. On one side stood an immense, fragmented administrative machine, rich in steel but poor in instinct, blindly following rigid procedures drawn up in peacetime. On the other side prowled a lean, starving pack of hardened veterans who operated as a single, fluid organism. The Americans were about to step into the unforgiving landscape of North Africa, believing that the sheer weight of their modern equipment would dictate the outcome. The veterans of the Afrika Korps were quietly waiting in the defiles and mountain passes, ready to teach their new, wealthy opponent the true, brutal currency of modern war. When the storm finally broke over the scattered American outposts at Sidi Bouzid in mid-February, the theoretical war instantly shattered against reality. American tank crews of the 1st Armored Division, eager to prove themselves, rushed forward to mount a heavy counterattack. Pushing across the open, arid plains, they spotted German panzers pulling back toward the eastern ridges. To an inexperienced eye, it looked exactly like a retreating force. The American crews, confident in their brand-new Shermans and hungry for a decisive clash, accelerated the pursuit. This was exactly what they had practiced in peacetime maneuvers: locate a fleeing enemy, close the distance, and destroy them. But the panzers were not retreating. They were bait. Hidden in the deep wadis and concealed behind sparse desert scrub were batteries of German 88mm flak guns, dug in so low their barrels barely cleared the sand. The veteran German gunners did not open fire at maximum range. They waited with chilling discipline until the charging American formations were perfectly silhouetted and completely committed to the open ground. Then the trap snapped shut. The execution took only minutes. The high-velocity 88mm shells tore through the American armor with terrifying ease. The triumphant pursuit evaporated into a chaotic slaughter. Shermans that had rolled off assembly lines just months prior were halted, dead in their tracks, their turrets violently thrown, brewing up in thick columns of oily, black smoke. Yet, the profound disaster unfolding in the Tunisian dust was not simply about a German gun outmatching an American tank. The ambush exposed the fatal flaw of a military that did not yet know how to operate as a single organism. As the lead tanks began to burn, the American response instantly fractured. A veteran force caught in this trap would have immediately deployed infantry to flank the concealed guns, called down concentrated artillery fire to blind the enemy, and radioed for immediate tactical air support. The Americans did none of this. Their armor was fighting utterly alone. The infantry was miles away, isolated on undefended hilltops by a fractured command structure. The American artillery units were physically present in the sector, but they were not seamlessly linked into the tankers' radio networks. The moment the ambush began, the rigid peacetime communications system collapsed under the friction of real combat. Radio channels became choked with overlapping, panicked voices, static, and contradictory orders from headquarters, situated miles behind the fighting. When communications failed, the American doctrine offered no backup plan. Without precise orders from above, and lacking the ingrained culture of battlefield initiative, junior officers simply froze. Platoon commanders lost contact with their companies. Companies lost contact with their battalions. The loss of a radio link did not just cause a localized delay, it triggered the total disintegration of entire combat units. A localized tactical setback rapidly metastasized into a massive, systemic collapse. American crews, isolated in the smoke, cut off from command, and terrified by the sudden, unseen destruction tearing through their ranks, began to break. Men abandoned perfectly functional vehicles. They climbed out of operational half-tracks, left the keys in the ignitions of their jeeps, and fled westward on foot. By the time the dust began to settle, the desert floor had been transformed into a sprawling graveyard of American industrial might. Unscathed trucks loaded with rations and fuel, pristine artillery pieces, and rows of abandoned tanks littered the landscape. The Afrika Korps had not merely outgunned the Americans, they had completely short-circuited their ability to function. German soldiers, men who had spent 2 years in the scorching North African theater, surviving on captured British rations, wearing sun-bleached uniforms, and drinking heavily chlorinated water from rusted jerry cans, found themselves surrounded by an incomprehensible abundance. They found jeeps sitting in the dirt, with the keys still dangling in the ignitions. They opened the backs of 2.5-ton trucks and found them packed to the canvas roofs with pristine M1 Garand rifles, heavy wool winter coats, cartons of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and mountains of canned food. They walked past brand-new M4 Shermans, the most mechanically reliable tanks in the world, sitting perfectly intact in the ditches. The tracks were not blown. The armor was not penetrated. The crews had simply panicked, thrown open the hatches, left the engines running, and sprinted away into the hills. To the exhausted German soldiers, this was a logistical windfall, but to the German intelligence officers and veteran commanders inspecting the battlefield, these abandoned machines were something far more profound. They were physical, undeniable proof of the enemy's moral bankruptcy. The Germans operated under a military philosophy that prized Kampfkraft, a concept roughly translating to combat power, but deeply rooted in fighting spirit, cohesion, and martial determination. When they looked at an idling, abandoned Sherman tank, they did not just see a captured vehicle. They analyzed the psychology of the men who had left it behind. To the German mind, the equation was brilliantly simple and entirely logical. A nation that provides its soldiers with the finest, most expensive military machinery in the history of the world, only for those soldiers to abandon it in sheer terror at the first sound of incoming fire, is a nation completely devoid of a martial soul. The German tactical diagnosis of the Battle of Kasserine Pass was, in fact, incredibly accurate. As they compiled their after-action reports, they noted that the American armor formations were clumsy and entirely disconnected from their infantry. They observed that American artillery fought its own separate war, unable to coordinate with the tanks. They saw that American communications were hopelessly undisciplined, leading to the rapid disintegration of entire battalions the moment a radio link was severed. They watched American junior officers freeze under pressure, lacking the ingrained initiative to make sudden battlefield decisions. They documented that isolated American soldiers surrendered far too quickly once they felt they were surrounded. Everything the Germans wrote down in their diagnostic reports was the absolute truth, but it was the truth only for that specific week in February 1943. And this is exactly where one of the most catastrophic intellectual errors of the Second World War was born. The German High Command took a perfectly accurate snapshot of a green, inexperienced army having a disastrous day, and they locked it in as the permanent, unchangeable identity of the United States military. Because their victory was so absolute, and because the physical evidence of American panic was so overwhelming, the Germans made a fatal leap in logic. They translated the observation that the Americans were fighting poorly right now into the foundational belief that the Americans were inherently, culturally, and biologically incapable of fighting well. They formulated a theory that would poison their strategic planning for the rest of the conflict. America is a country of factories, but not a country of soldiers. They believed that while the United States could mass-produce tanks and airplanes at a terrifying rate, they could never manufacture fighting spirit, resilience, or competent battlefield leadership. But as the German intelligence apparatus was busy cementing this flawed assumption, the perspective from the Allied side of the front lines was radically different. To the Americans, the smoking wrecks littering the Kasserine Pass were not evidence of a permanent national humiliation. They were a brutal, highly detailed diagnostic report. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, traveled to the shattered front in the immediate aftermath of the rout, he drove past the exact same destroyed half-tracks and confused, demoralized survivors that the Germans had seen. But Eisenhower did not look at the fleeing private and conclude that the American soldier was inherently weak. The United States military did not share the German obsession with mystical warrior spirit. They viewed war fundamentally as an industrial, engineering, and management problem. If a massive, complex machine fails catastrophically under stress, you do not throw away the blueprint and declare the project impossible. You look at the diagnostic data, you locate the defective components, you tear them out, you redesign the circuitry, and you rebuild the engine. For Eisenhower, it was immediately clear that the defective component was not the private in the foxhole. The failure was systemic, and the rot started at the very top. The disaster at Kasserine was the direct result of a peacetime military culture that had suffocated instinct with rigid procedure. It was the result of commanders like Major General Lloyd Fredendall trying to micromanage a chaotic, fluid battle from a concrete bunker 70 miles behind the lines. Eisenhower did exactly what the German system, which was often paralyzed by personal loyalties and political infighting at the highest levels, struggled to do quickly. He ruthlessly purged the defective components. Fredendall was instantly relieved of his command. The underground bunker at Speedy Valley was abandoned. The peacetime architects of the disaster were systematically removed. To replace them, and to deliver the immediate shock therapy that a shattered corps desperately needed, Eisenhower brought in Major General George S. Patton. History often remembers Patton's arrival in North Africa through a theatrical lens. The oversized stars on his command car, the sirens, the ivory-handled revolvers, the polished helmet, and the relentless profanity. But what Patton unleashed on the American Second Corps was not a cult of personality. It was a deeply calculated, highly deliberate mechanism designed to force a broken military organization to rebuild its chain of command. Patton understood that you could not wave a magic wand and instantly grant 50,000 men the combat experience of the Afrika Korps, but you could force them to remember their discipline. The moment Patton arrived, he physically moved the command post out of the deep rear and pushed it forward, visibly placing himself in the danger zone, proving to the men that their leadership was no longer hiding in a cave. Then, he issued a series of orders that, to the battered and exhausted survivors of Kasserine, seemed like absolute tyrannical madness. He mandated that every single soldier, regardless of their job, had to wear their heavy steel helmet at all times, even if they were mechanics working miles behind the front. Neckties were to be worn in the desert heat. Uniforms had to be strictly regulation. Leggings had to be laced perfectly. He deployed military police across the sector to hand out crushing financial fines to any soldier caught with an unshaven face or unpolished boots. To a corps that had just watched its tanks burn and its friends die, these orders felt like petty, disconnected harassment. But Patton was not interested in fashion. He was engaged in psychological rewiring. He knew that when a tired, frightened soldier obeys an uncomfortable, seemingly pointless rule about wearing a necktie in the desert, he is actively submitting to the chain of command. He is relearning the habit of obedience. If a soldier cannot be trusted to wear his helmet when he is safe in the rear, he cannot be trusted to hold his ground when he is terrified under incoming artillery fire. Patton was brutally rebuilding the fundamental reflex of discipline that had completely dissolved under the German guns. Simultaneously, Patton directed his shock therapy at the officer corps. Any commander who hesitated, who remained in their tent instead of moving to the observation posts, or who failed to enforce the new rigid standards, was instantly relieved of duty. He demanded that junior officers step up, promoting battlefield initiative and screaming at them to make decisions without waiting for a radio call from headquarters. The American Second Corps was being dragged, violently and uncomfortably, out of its peacetime lethargy and into the reality of war. But a massive question hung over the North African desert. You can change a commanding general, you can fire ineffective officers, and you can force men to wear their helmets under threat of a fine. But can you actually fix the deep, systemic, structural flaws of an entire army in a matter of weeks? Can a force that was just surgically dismantled by the Afrika Korps truly learn how to absorb a heavy punch without shattering? The answer to that question began to materialize shortly after, near a dusty valley called El Guettar. The German 10th Panzer Division, riding the psychological high of their recent victories and confident in their newly established profile of the American military, moved out to crush the U.S. forces once again. The German commanders expected to see a repeat of Kasserine. They expected fragmented defenses, panicked communication, and an infantry line that would break and run the moment the panzers closed the distance. As the German armor rolled across the open valley floor, kicking up massive clouds of dust, the American lines braced for impact. But this time, the lines did not buckle. The shock therapy had taken hold. Instead of disorganized riflemen fighting in isolated, unsupported pockets, the Germans encountered an American infantry that held its ground, dug in deep, and refused to break contact. The soldiers did not run. But the most terrifying surprise for the Afrika Korps was not the resilience of the American infantry. It was what was happening in the hills, looking down on the valley. During the initial disaster, the Americans had driven their tanks blindly forward into concealed German anti-tank guns, falling into a perfectly laid trap. At Guettar, the roles were violently, mathematically reversed. The German armor pushed confidently forward into the valley, unwittingly driving directly into a massive, pre-calculated kill zone. This time, American artillery was not sitting idle in the rear, waiting for vague orders over jammed radio frequencies. The Americans had pushed their forward observers high onto the ridges, looking directly down at the advancing German columns. And crucially, the American communications network, tightened and ruthlessly disciplined under Patton's reforms, functioned exactly as it was designed to. The observers did not panic. They spoke quietly into their field radios and field telephones, transmitting precise coordinates to massed artillery batteries positioned safely miles behind the front. Within seconds, the sky over the German panzers tore open. The American artillery did not fire in uncoordinated, sporadic bursts. They utilized massed, concentrated fire, bringing the guns of multiple different battalions to bear on the exact same target area at the exact same moment. The 10th Panzer Division found itself suddenly engulfed in an apocalyptic storm of high explosives. For the first time in the North African campaign, the veterans of the Afrika Korps found themselves pinned down, unable to maneuver, and systematically battered by an enemy they had dismissed as cowards just weeks earlier. The American system had absorbed the German punch, held its ground, and delivered a devastating, coordinated counterblow. The panzers were forced to withdraw, leaving their own smoking wrecks on the valley floor. Guettar was not the total strategic destruction of the German forces in North Africa, but it was a crucial, undeniable data point. It was the first concrete physical proof that the American army was capable of rapid, lethal adaptation. The communications network had worked. The coordination between infantry and massed artillery had functioned flawlessly. The psychological brittleness the Germans had observed at Kasserine had vanished. The German commanders sitting in their command half-tracks watched their assault fail, and they clearly recognized that something in the American lines had changed. They noticed that the infantry had not run. They felt the overwhelming weight and precision of the massed artillery fire. But here is where the psychological trap snapped completely shut, securing the disaster that would eventually consume the Third Reich. When German intelligence officers and field commanders analyzed the repulse at Guettar, they did not revise their foundational model of the American military. The victory at Kasserine had been so absolute, so conceptually satisfying, and so perfectly aligned with their belief in German martial superiority that they simply could not let it go. Instead of looking at Guettar as the beginning of a systemic American transformation, the Germans rationalized it as a fluke. They explained away the shifting reality to protect their established theory. They wrote off the American resilience as the result of a lucky artillery performance. They concluded that they had simply run into one exceptionally good division, or that the specific topography of the valley had artificially favored the defense. They looked at the devastating massed artillery fire and told themselves that the Americans were merely relying on their endless, unfair supply of industrial ammunition to compensate for their inherent lack of tactical skill. By isolating Guettar as an exception to the rule, the Germans successfully quarantined the new, contradictory evidence. They preserved their foundational belief that the Americans were inherently weak, easily broken, and dependent on rigid, clumsy procedures. As the campaign in Tunisia ground toward its inevitable conclusion and the Axis forces were eventually pushed out of Africa, this deeply flawed assessment was packaged, stamped, and sent back to the High Command in Berlin. German intelligence systematically collected thousands of observation reports, prisoner interrogations, and after-action summaries from the Desert War, and they distilled the entire North African experience into a unified, official model of the American fighting man. Kasserine was elevated from a single, localized defeat into a defining psychological profile. The American army, the official reports concluded, was materially overwhelming, but it remained psychologically brittle. They could not handle concentrated shock. If you hit them hard enough and fast enough, their command structure would inevitably collapse. Their soldiers would abandon their equipment, and their numerical superiority would evaporate. This was exactly the answer the German High Command wanted and desperately needed to hear. By 1943 and into 1944, Germany was bleeding to death in the frozen ruins of the Soviet Union. Their resources were dangerously thin. They knew with absolute certainty that an Allied invasion of Western Europe was coming, and they knew they would not have the troops, the tanks, or the fuel to fight a prolonged war of attrition on two fronts. If the American army was truly a brittle, clumsy behemoth that shattered under sudden extreme violence, then Germany had a viable strategic path to survival. They didn't need to win a multi-year campaign in France. They just needed to deliver one massive, concentrated shock at the water's edge. The German strategic theory became clear. Destroy the beachhead in the first 24 hours, trigger that American psychological collapse, and the invasion would fail before American industrial superiority could even deploy across the ocean. The entire blueprint for defending Western Europe was built on the premise that the American Army of 1944 would behave exactly like the American Army of February 1943, and the men who were sent to build those defenses, including Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had personally witnessed the American collapse at Kasserine, designed the Atlantic Wall to fight the enemy they remembered. The tension was now locked into place on a global scale. Germany was about to spend an entire year pouring millions of tons of concrete and shifting its finest panzer divisions to prepare for an enemy that no longer existed. Because while the Germans were aggressively protecting their flawed conclusion, the Americans were quietly treating their defeat as an engineering problem, tearing down their peacetime system and rebuilding a completely unrecognizable machine of war. The Atlantic Wall was not merely a physical barrier of concrete and steel. It was a psychological weapon, precision engineered for a very specific target. The German High Command designed the coastal defenses of Western Europe around the exact vulnerabilities they had cataloged in the desert: the millions of buried mines, the jagged, submerged obstacles, and the pre-sighted artillery kill zones were all mathematically positioned to deliver a sudden, overwhelming trauma. German intelligence guaranteed that if the Americans were hit with enough concentrated violence at the water's edge, their radio networks would choke with panicked voices, their junior officers would freeze, and their infantry would hopelessly separate from their armor. The entire defense of Normandy was explicitly calibrated to trigger a second Kasserine Pass. But while the Third Reich poured its rapidly depleting resources into fortifying the coast against the army of 1943, the United States War Department was quietly dissecting its own humiliation. The Americans did not try to bury the North African disaster out of pride, nor did they try to prove the German after-action reports wrong. Instead, they accepted the enemy's brutal diagnostic profile as a free, highly detailed checklist of their own defects. Then, they methodically engineered out every single flaw. The peacetime culture that had protected hesitant leadership was eradicated. The mechanism for removing ineffective officers was ruthlessly streamlined. If a commander failed to show aggression and initiative during maneuvers in Britain, he was quietly replaced before he ever saw a live battlefield. The devastating fragmentation of their combat arms was systematically rewired. To fix their disconnected artillery, the Americans perfected the Fire Direction Center, a revolutionary communication hub that allowed a single forward observer with a radio to synchronize the guns of multiple battalions, bringing down a mathematically precise storm of high explosives in a matter of minutes. The deadly disconnect between the air and ground forces was solved by physically embedding Air Corps liaison officers directly into frontline jeeps, armed with dedicated VHF radios to coordinate strikes with fighter bombers orbiting above the battlefield. Sterile, peacetime drills were scrapped entirely. Stateside training was redesigned around the immediate, bloody lessons of the desert, utilizing live ammunition, deafening noise, and intentionally severed communication lines. Young lieutenants and sergeants were repeatedly thrown into chaotic, simulated combat scenarios where they were forced to make immediate tactical decisions without waiting for a bunker to issue an order. For 12 months, the two nations operated in completely separate realities. The German High Command confidently locked in their model, staking the survival of their empire on the foundational belief that American troops were psychologically brittle. They had no idea that across the English Channel, the United States had transformed observation, communication, and industrial firepower into a repeatable, devastating process. The ultimate confrontation was now set. Germany was desperately preparing to fight a ghost, completely unaware that a newly forged, unrecognizable machine was waiting just over the horizon. On June 6, 1944, the Germans finally received the chance to test their carefully constructed model. As the Allied invasion fleet materialized off the coast of Normandy, the German defensive plan activated precisely as designed. Initially, the brutal friction of the landings seemed to validate everything German intelligence had promised. On Omaha Beach, the chaos was absolute. Communications broke down, officers were killed, units were scrambled and pinned down under a merciless crossfire. To the German defenders peering through the gun slits of their concrete bunkers, it looked exactly like the beginning of another Kasserine-style collapse. They expected the isolated, bleeding American infantry to freeze, abandon their equipment, and inevitably break under the concentrated shock. But as the battle moved off the beaches and into the suffocating claustrophobic terrain of the bocage, the ancient hedgerows of Normandy, the Germans encountered the first physical evidence that their model was completely obsolete. It wasn't immediately obvious in the grand strategic movements. It revealed itself in the microscopic, brutal details of small unit combat. Deep in the bocage, an elite German machine gun team composed of seasoned veterans perfectly ambushed an American platoon. The Germans were heavily dug in behind a thick earthen bank, completely invisible in the dense foliage. Based on the Kasserine profile, they expected the pinned-down, inexperienced Americans to attempt a clumsy, disorganized frontal assault, which the MG-42 would effortlessly tear apart. Or, perhaps, they expected the Americans to simply freeze in the dirt until their morale shattered. Instead, an American lieutenant pressed flat against the muddy earth didn't order a suicidal charge. He pulled the handset of an SCR-300 backpack radio, a piece of technology that allowed infantry to seamlessly link with the rest of the army. He quietly transmitted a set of grid coordinates. The German machine gunners waited for the infantry assault that never came. Minutes later, the sky above them ripped open. A battery of 105mm howitzers, stationed miles away and completely unseen, delivered a devastating, mathematically perfect concentration of high explosives directly onto the hedgerow. The German position was violently erased, not by the rifles of the men in front of them, but by the interconnected system standing miles behind them. The realization began to spread slowly and then rapidly through the German lines. A panzer, hiding inside a heavy stone barn, preparing a lethal ambush, wasn't engaged by a brave but outgunned Sherman. Instead, a tiny, unarmed Piper Cub reconnaissance aircraft, hovering lazily just out of anti-aircraft range, spotted the tracks leading into the barn. The pilot radioed the coordinates, and within minutes, a flight of P-47 Thunderbolts plunged from the clouds, annihilating the barn and the tank inside. The Germans were no longer fighting isolated groups of easily terrified soldiers. They were fighting a massive, highly efficient network. The American infantrymen, the backpack radio, the forward observer, the distant artillery battery, the reconnaissance aircraft, the fighter bombers, and the endless logistics train were no longer separate branches fighting their own isolated wars. They had fused into one terrifying, interconnected machine. The German tactical skill, their individual bravery, and their years of combat experience were suddenly localized and irrelevant. A single German squad thought they were engaging an American platoon. In reality, through that radio, they were fighting the concentrated industrial firepower of an entire division. This relentless, systemized pressure began to crush the life out of Germany's finest units. Panzerlehr, one of the most elite, heavily armored formations in the entire Wehrmacht, was thrown into the line to break the American advance. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein was an Afrika Korps veteran. He had personally witnessed the American weakness in the desert. He believed he understood this enemy. But in Normandy, Panzerlehr didn't face a clumsy armor charge. They were subjected to a relentless, unyielding storm of coordinated artillery and relentless fighter-bomber strikes. They were ground down, hour by hour, day by day, by an enemy that almost never allowed them to engage in the close-quarters tactical brawling where the Germans excelled. The system simply erased them from a distance. As his elite division deteriorated under the endless mechanical violence, Bayerlein would later describe his surviving troops as being completely morally beaten. It was a staggering, deeply ironic echo. Morally beaten was the exact phrase the Germans had arrogantly used to diagnose the Americans just over a year earlier in Tunisia. The system they had mocked as brittle had returned, reorganized and ruthless, to break the very veterans who had judged them. The irony was absolute. At Kasserine, the Germans had correctly identified nearly every American vulnerability. The chaotic communications, the disconnected artillery, the inexperienced junior officers, the over-reliance on a rigid peacetime doctrine, every flaw the Afrika Korps exploited was undeniably real. But the German High Command committed a fatal intellectual error. They mistook a diagnostic photograph for a permanent portrait. They believed those weaknesses were ingrained in the very identity of the American soldier, a cultural defect that could not be engineered away. They assumed that a nation capable of building flawless machines could never manufacture martial resilience. The Americans looked at the exact same weaknesses, standing amid the exact same smoking ruins, and reached an entirely different conclusion. They treated their defeat not as a permanent character flaw, but as a complex engineering problem demanding precise, actionable solutions. The true strength of the American military system was never invincibility. Its greatest weapon was the structural capacity to absorb a humiliating, highly public catastrophe, openly admit its profound operational failures, ruthlessly replace its defective leadership, completely rewrite its doctrine, and return to the battlefield as a fundamentally transformed adversary. Germany spent the better part of a year and millions of tons of concrete meticulously preparing to fight an army that no longer existed. They built the Atlantic Wall to shatter the clumsy, brittle force they remembered from the North African desert. By the time they realized their mistake, by the time that single German machine gunner realized he was no longer fighting a frightened platoon, but an interconnected, continent-spanning machine, it was far too late. The tactical brilliance of the Afrika Korps in 1943 had been undeniable, but that very brilliance created the blinding illusion that ultimately doomed the Third Reich. The sweeping victory at Kasserine Pass became the trap. When that veteran German soldier stood next to an idling, abandoned Sherman tank in the Tunisian desert in 1943, he thought he was looking at the absolute, unchangeable limit of American capability. In reality, he was only looking at a diagnostic photograph of their very first mistake. And accepting that photograph as the permanent truth became the ultimate, fatal trap.